Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar Social Compacts for Sustainable Financing of Social Protection Systems. This is the third webinar series, session in our series of Fiscal Space for Social Protection. This knowledge sharing initiative is hosted by socialprotection.org platform. And I'd like to invite everyone to join the platform and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. On the platform you'll find information regarding the Fiscal Space for Social Protection Knowledge Sharing Initiative, where you can stay up to date with the webinar series and what will be happening in the future. On the platform, you'll also have access to the Knowledge Sharing Initiative, which is a partnership between HelpAge International and the International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth. My name is Daniel Horn. I will be your moderator. I'm the Economic Advisor for Social Protection at HelpAge International, where I focus both on the economic impacts of demographic change and the tax benefit mix for sustainable and universal social protection floors. Our first presenter is Michael Herrmann, who is Senior Advisor of Economics and Manager of the Innovation Fund at the United Nations Population Fund. He is a member of the Lead Economist Network of the UN, and he has worked extensively on employment, poverty, income distribution, and social protection. Importantly, he works exclusively on economic development, sovereign debt, development financing, and macroeconomic policies, as well as trade and commodity markets. He has published a range of issues, including the implications of demographic change for development, as well as sustainable development and food security. Our second presenter, Professor Armando Barrientos, is Professor of Poverty and Social Justice at the Global Development Institute. He is also co-director of the International Research Initiative on Brazil and Africa. Armando will be presenting following Michael, and I'd like to just note a few housekeeping rules. Please feel free to type your questions and type them into the chat box on the screen so we can share this with the presenters. We'll have 2 to 3 rounds of questions, and the first round of questions will be dedicated to directed questions towards Michael and Armando. Second and third rounds, depending on time, will be more general questions. Do be reminded that all questions will be available later on the platform and answered in the order we received them. With that, I'd like to pass on to Michael Herrmann. And Michael, if you will.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Welcome everyone to this online seminar, this online training. We are quite pressed for time, so we don't have a hell of a lot of time for this session. And the topic to be covered is in fact quite complex. So, you will have a chance later on, as Daniel just said, to pose any questions that you might have, if anything is not clear. Let me begin with the first slide, if you would please move forward. One more, please. Next one. A useful way to examine social protection, social transfers within an economy is in fact to construct what is called a national transfer account. Many countries already have national transfer accounts. Brazil is one of them. Other countries, including in the poorest countries in the poorest parts of the world in Africa, are constructing national transfer accounts as we speak. What do national transfer accounts show us? Broadly speaking, they plot national accounts data on consumption and labor income by age. And this is what you see in this chart. The blue field is consumption expenditures, and you see they are from the age of 0 to the age of 90. And the orange field is labor income. Now, if you look at this, you will see that over the course of a lifespan, consumption expenditures actually do exceed labor income, and hence we call this a life cycle deficit. This life cycle deficit is at the heart of national transfer accounts analysis. And once we have constructed a national transfer account, once we have plotted this life cycle deficit for countries, we can in very deep ways examine how are consumption expenditures of those who don't have a labor income, young children, before the age of 20, as you see in this chart, or older persons above the age of 60, 65, how are these consumption expenditures financed? Yeah? If it's not financed out of their labor income, how do they finance these expenditures? And there are several ways to finance these expenditures. One, of course, people can run down savings that they might have in a bank account to finance their consumption expenditures. That's less likely for children, more likely for, of course, the older population. But also, and importantly, the largest share of these expenditures is financed through transfers. And we need to distinguish two types of transfers. One is informal intra-household transfers. It's grandchildren giving money to, grandparents giving money to their children, or it's children sending money home to their parents. This is informal types of transfers within families. But a large share of transfers, especially as countries move up the ladder of development, more and more transfers actually become formalized and become transfers inter-household, between households. And they're basically public social transfers, what we often refer to as social protection. Now, looking at this life cycle deficit, many policymakers and observers panic. They say, oh my God, look, you have all these, children consume more than they earn. Yeah? Older people consume more than they earn. Now imagine we have an aging country, an aging economy, an aging society, and we have more and more older people that consume more than they earn. Now, is this sustainable? It's an important question in many people's minds and in the minds of policymakers. Can we support the increase in consumption expenditures of older people? And many people here, you will hear many times, and I hear this almost daily, a call for reducing expenditures on pension and also healthcare, because these are the two most important expenditures of the older people, in order to lower the fiscal burden, let's say, in an aging society. Interestingly, we don't hear people saying, oh, we should reduce our expenditure on children, yeah? Or children should start working earlier because we're worried about expenditures of children. Most people are worried about expenditures on older people. Now this of course poses the question, what are we really worried about? Are we worried about expenditures as such, that people have higher consumption expenditures than labor income? If that's the case, the question really is, why are we not concerned that children might consume? Or is there something underlying that's kind of a perverse logic? Maybe people think, oh, it's okay to spend on children because in fact we should spend on children, it builds their human capital, and then they will pay it off in the course of their life because they move into this productive age where labor income exceeds consumption expenditures. Whereas on older people, they might go belly up sometime soon, so spending money on them or for them is not so useful. So this could be one, we'll try to understand why do people say we should reduce consumption expenditures. So let me turn to the next slide, if you would. Could somebody please flip forward with the slides? Okay, so next one, please. What does a life cycle deficit mean from an individual perspective? As I just alluded to, I think it makes no sense to think, okay, we shouldn't spend money on children, or children shouldn't have a consumption expenditures. We need to invest in children. We also don't want children to work earlier so they have a labor income. Now, should we spend less on older people? Should older people consume less in terms of pensions, healthcare, other things? There is a lot to be said about reforming systems, pension or healthcare systems that are not functioning. Yeah? But I don't think the objective can be, per se, to reduce consumption expenditures of older people. Why would we want to do that? There is, from an individual perspective, I would find this very hard, and from an ethical perspective to justify. From an economic perspective, as I will explain shortly, it is not a necessary condition in many countries. There is no economic necessity to, per se, reduce the spending of older people, by the contrast. Now we'll touch on this in a minute. So maybe you could move forward to the next slide, looking at this from a macroeconomic perspective. If we don't want to, let's say, adjust the consumption expenditures per se of younger people or older people, yeah, we need to ask ourselves and step back and say, is it actually a problem? Is it a problem that labor income is lower than consumption expenditures? Is there any country in the world where labor income is so high that it would cover consumption expenditures over a life course? I can tell you from all the NTAs that were constructed for all the countries, there is no country where labor income alone will cover consumption expenditures. It's not given, and in fact, I would say it's not necessary, because consumption expenditures can be financed from other sources and is being financed from other sources than labor income. I mentioned it earlier, people can run down savings, people can finance that through transfers, but also people can finance it, or societies and economies can finance consumption expenditures through by assuming more debt. So if it can be financed from different types of sources other than labor income, why are we worried about, or why are many people worried about the consumption expenditures, especially of the older populations in aging societies? The answer to that rests in is not given by national transfer accounts at all. National transfer accounts just show us how national accounts data is distributed. National transfer accounts data do not tell us how to read and interpret the data and the distribution of consumption, savings, and income in any meaningful way. How we interpret national transfer accounts is solely dependent on our understanding of the economy, and there are different schools of thought. Let me speak about this a little bit in the next slide, please. Could you please move forward with the slide? So in some cases, we know from the national accounts of an economy, S equals I, savings equal investment. Now this is often interpreted, it's really nothing but an accounting identity. That's important to emphasize. But some schools of thought argue that saving is a precondition for investment, basically. You need to have savings in order to invest. And we hear this often in the debate on aging. We have to save more and more money to ensure higher and higher investment. But let me emphasize, this is not how the world works. It's also not how other economic theories see it. Think of a company that benefits from a lot of demand for its products will not say, oh shucks, I can't build the second factory that I need because I don't have savings. The company will go to the bank and say, please, can you give me a loan? I have a lot of demand out there. Let me build a second factory, and I will produce these goods, and over time, I will pay back my debt. So saving is not a precondition in that case for investment. In fact, saving comes as a consequence of investment. Okay, so it flows the other way. So this is just how it many times actually works in reality. This way it works for many of us. If we buy a house, many other things, we don't just save all the money, we just take on a loan. So, and in fact, other theories of thought, other economic schools of thought would tell you, if you try to accumulate savings as much as you can in order to enable investment, there's no guarantee that you will actually get productive investment, okay? Because a lot of the money that people are saving could be used for all kinds of speculations in real estate markets, for all kinds of other things. And much more important than the saving is, in fact, the consumption or the demand, the aggregate demand of an economy that will drive investment. Yeah? It's also important to note that unlike individuals, we can save money for the future. We can put money into a bank account as an individual. An economy cannot save money for the future. The only way an economy can transfer wealth from the present to the future is by investing its resources productively in the present. So there's a big difference between individuals and an economy. So the point here is that higher consumption is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, higher consumption can be a driving force for investment. To bring this back to our example of the older people, imagine older people have no money. They have no consumption whatsoever. There will be no demand from older people. Now look at a rich society. You have more and more older people with more and more money. They spend more and more on healthcare. What's the problem? Healthcare is a multi-billion-dollar business. It stimulates the pharma industry, the medical machineries, the care industry. There are jobs in the medical sector. The medical sector generates income. What's the problem if the medical sector or the health sector expands? It's just a reflection of changing patterns of demand. And in a functional economy, the production would respond to changing patterns of demand. This is not to be said, again, that some systems, they have rising costs and they are not matched by a service delivery, and these systems obviously need to be reformed. So in some cases, rising healthcare expenditures are not attributable to the fact that there are more people consuming health and they get more goods and services, but rising healthcare expenditures might be related to the fact that we have inefficiencies in the system, we have monopolies, we have stifling regulations that prevent competition, we have all kinds of things, and we have an explosion of costs because of inefficiencies. These need to be addressed, now, obviously. So let me turn to the policy conclusions. If you could flip forward, please. I think it's important, based on what I just said, this has important implications for two things, for policy and for the design of social protection systems. Let me address these in turn. Let me focus on the policy aspects first. If you could flip forward, please. The next slide, please. So policy implications, generally speaking, in a country that has an aging population, we don't have to be afraid about rising consumption expenditures per se. It is a problem, or let's say it's not a problem. As long as we have a growing economy, theoretically, we can cater for more and more dependence. Also, if economies have a growing labor productivity, they can cater for more dependence. Let me give you an example. In Africa, a lot of people are working. There's a lot of people in the working age. But they have a very low labor productivity. They have very low income, and because of it, they can support only very few dependents. In the OECD countries, on average, labor productivity is 110 times as high as in the world's least developed countries. Even if we have fewer people working in the working age population, but they have a high and growing labor productivity, they can support, all else equal, more and more dependents. So whether an economy, a society, can support more dependence really strongly depends, of course, on its labor productivity and on its per capita economic growth. If labor productivity is good, per capita economic growth, theoretically, an economy can support more dependence. The big question in my mind is, if you look at France, protests in France and many other countries about the reform of pension systems, is not only whether an economy can afford more, to pay more on the older people. It's actually at the heart, it's a distributive question. How do societies, see the allocation of their resources? What is the social consensus within the societies? Are societies prepared to spend more on older people or not? Do they rather spend on young people? Or maybe they rather have very low transfers, social transfers. And there is no uniform answer to this. A social consensus that you might reach in the north of Europe, in Scandinavia, would never be acceptable in the United States of America. So in many cases, the policy discussions we see, I would argue, are not driven by a macroeconomic logic. They are at the heart discussions about social consensus and in what societies we want to live, and about social distribution. If you could move forward, please, to the last slide of the presentation. So if we are designing social protection systems, I think one thing important to keep in mind is, of course, in what context are these systems living? And one is, of course, are they living in economies where we have growing labor productivity, where we have growing GDP per capita? What's the scope, the economic limits and ramifications of a system? But beyond that, we also should aspire, in my mind, to build much more dynamic systems than we had in the past. Look, a system is not sustainable. Just, the definition of a sustainability of a system cannot be a system that we never have to adjust. Everything we do has to be always adjusted to new economic realities. A pension system that we created decades ago will need to be adjusted to the new realities of the world. If you're changing interest rates today, they need to be adjusted tomorrow. We're implementing a certain tax policy today, that tax policy has to change. Likewise, social protection systems have to change with the economic context, with the demographic context. So, and I would say this is no reason to panic. That just means change is natural, change is inevitable. A sustainable system is a system that can be changed without completely throwing up, overhauling it. And it's not a sustainable system. It's not a system that we can develop today and that will last for the next 200 years. So, with that as a background, I would argue that moving forward, we have to develop a different understanding of social protection systems. Right now, we have very fragmented systems. We look at pension systems separate from social security, separate from unemployment, separate from child care or disability. Separate, all these systems we look at and dissect separately from each other. And we seek to optimize each of these systems, and when I say we, I don't mean literally we, the United Nations Population Fund at all. What I mean is the community of people engaged in this discussion out there oftentimes seek to optimize these systems for the bottom line. They say we need to have systems that are more cost effective. But the most cost effective is the system that we don't have. If we want to save costs, we should just not have a system. We have to optimize systems for their efficacy, for their ability to empower and protect people. And right now, we're looking at all these systems in a dissected manner, and it might be actually much better to look at these systems in a coherent and integrated manner, because maybe the protection that you extend to an individual earlier in life might mean that this individual is less likely to depend on social protection later in life. So there is an argument to be made for taking an integrated look at all systems of social protection. That's one thing. The second thing I would argue is that we should move away from thinking about social protection systems, and I don't like the word protection in that sense, as something very passive. Right now, the way we think about them is safety nets. If a person falls, if a household falls, if they lose income, we want to catch them and prevent them from slipping into poverty. But this is a minimalist view in my understanding what a social protection system should achieve. Ideally, a social protection system wouldn't just catch a person or a household from falling and prevent them from slipping into poverty. It would actually empower them to live a more active life, to participate more actively in society. So my other major point would be to say, let's look at this integration of systems and optimize them with respect to their efficacy, and not only understood as helping people not to fall into poverty, but actually empowering people to participate more actively in society. In conclusion, the social protection systems that we design in countries, let's not jump to conclude. I mean, let's not come to hasty conclusions. Many times we look at social protection systems and say, we can't afford them. They are too expensive. Now we have more older people. It's impossible. That's a hasty conclusion. Let's not jump to conclusions. Firstly, from an economic perspective, we can afford social protection systems if we have rising labor productivity and if we have rising GDP per capita. If we want to afford more expensive social protection systems is at the heart a question of social consensus and social dialogue, and there is no uniform answer to that. Whatever systems we are going to design for the future, I would argue we need to move away from dissecting these systems even further, from taking a partial look at systems. We need to integrate social protection systems throughout a life course, and that includes disability, social security, unemployment benefits, pensions. They need to be integrated, and I would say public works. And we need to design systems that are not only passively helping people, prevent them from slipping into poverty, but actually empower people to participate more actively in the social and economic life of their communities. Thank you very much. This concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Michael. I very much appreciate your thoughts on the macro side of the issue, specifically the systems being dynamic and the life course approach, or at least considerations. I'd now like to turn to our second guest, Armando Barrientos, who will talk about taxes and the social compact. Armando, go ahead and hand that over to you.
Hello everyone. My presentation is going to be focused on one aspect or one component of social protection, which is social assistance. The reason why it's important to separate out social assistance from the other components when we look at the issues of financing is that the tax system and also the kind of the strength of the social contracts in different countries are important in terms of determining the efficiency and the coverage and the reach of social assistance programs. Now, let me say something about the difference between the components of social protection. On the one hand, you have social insurance that is usually funded out of contributions by employers, by workers, and also by governments to funds which provide support in case of contingencies associated with the life course, for example, retirement. Also provide protection for workers in the event of a fall in income, for example, through unemployment or through sickness or through disability. Social assistance, on the other hand, is focused on poverty reduction. It provides support, social minimum, to families that have standards of living that are below what is acceptable in particular societies. Now, social assistance is primarily and largely funded out of taxation from budget revenues. And therefore, this is why we need to look at the issue of taxation and social contracts. If I could move on to the next slide, please. A good starting point for looking at the issues of financing in social assistance is to look at what different countries are already spending on social assistance, to have a sense of what is the amount of resources that a society should direct towards social assistance expenditure. And you see in front of you a table with information for around 143 countries, low income, middle income, and high income. There are some kind of issues with the data. The data come from 3 different sources. The World Bank data focuses mainly on low income and low and middle income countries. There is data from the ILO that focuses on middle income countries, and also data from the OECD that focuses on high income countries. So the actual categories used to estimate social assistance expenditure might not be exactly the same across all three different categories of countries. But nonetheless, we get a sense of the amount of expenditure that countries are already assigning to social assistance. You see that in the first place that there is a very wide range. You go from countries that they spend a fraction of 1% of GDP on the right-hand side, and then all the way to the countries on the left-hand side that they spend between 6 and 7% of GDP on social assistance. So there is a very wide range of experiences for all the different countries. That is perhaps the first point. The second point is that around 3/4 of all countries in the chart spend between 1 and 2% of GDP. So it would appear that both middle income and low income countries, some of them are in that particular range. The third thing which is really interesting from the data is the following, that there isn't a one-to-one relationship between what countries spend on social assistance and their level of economic development. If you look at on the left-hand side of the table, you find that the first two countries are Australia and probably New Zealand, and then the third country is Malawi, a low-income country from sub-Saharan Africa. And if you look on the right-hand side, you'll find that the Uruguay is very close to the countries that spend a very small fraction of GDP on social assistance. Uruguay is a high-income country which has very strong social protection institutions. So the expenditure on social assistance is not primarily dependent on economic development, but is more dependent or more strongly determined by the kind of institutions that different countries decide to have. So, for example, Australia and New Zealand gave primacy to social assistance in the construction of their social protection policies. And this is why they spend such a high amount of their GDP on social assistance. Whereas Uruguay, on the other hand, gave much more priority to building social insurance. And to the extent that the social insurance covers the majority of workers in Uruguay, then there is much less need for social assistance. The next point to make, which is not shown by the figures in the chart, is that over time there is a trend for countries to spend an increasing amount of assigning an increasing amount of their expenditure to social assistance. Although we don't have very reliable figures to be able to provide you with an estimate of that rising trend. If I can move to the next slide, please. This summarizes the main points that I have made using that data. Can we move on to the next slide, please? What are the implications for policy from the chart that we've just seen? I think the clear implication for policy is this, that perhaps countries should look at increasing their expenditure on social assistance incrementally. There isn't a single figure that countries should aim to spend. But clearly, countries that are spending less than 1% of GDP should make an effort to reach 1% of GDP. Countries that are between 1 and 2% of GDP perhaps should look incrementally to increasing their social expenditure on social assistance to around 2% of GDP. So what we're looking, the main policy implications for low and middle income countries is therefore to look at expanding social assistance gradually over time, rather than having a particular benchmark figure in mind. Now, if we then set that as the main objective, then I think we need to look at three important dimensions of financing social assistance. And this is very important because the general focus of discussion, particularly in international development, is really only on the first dimension, that is on resource mobilization. we're all really concerned about how we can generate much greater financial support for social assistance in low and middle income countries. And therefore we're focused on finding new sources of financing. Where can we get this? Can we get this from international aid? Can we get this from remittances? Where can we get additional financing? That is usually described by the term fiscal space. Fiscal space defines the government capacity to allocate resources to activities or programs without reducing financial support for existing activities or programs. So we're looking at resource mobilization, new sources of funding. However, that focus only on resource mobilization leaves out of our concern another two dimensions of financing which are crucial. The second one is legitimacy. In many cases, the financing of social assistance influence the support that these institutions have. For example, from parliament, from government, from public opinion, from political parties. Social assistance not only has to have the right and efficient and effective institutions, but also must be legitimate in the eyes of the public. That is what will ensure that the institutions are sustainable in low and middle income countries. So legitimacy is really important. It's not a matter of finding resources from anywhere. It is important also that the way in which we finance social assistance lends legitimacy to social assistance institutions. The third one is effectiveness, because financing modalities also have an influence over the effectiveness of social assistance. So if they are financed in particular ways, that will generate incentives both among program agencies or among potential participants to take particular courses of actions that will be effective in reducing poverty. So effectiveness is also important. Now, if we take those three dimensions, you can see how some sources of financing of social assistance perhaps are more likely to be effective than others. In low-income countries, for example, that lack resources coming through the budget, it is increasingly common that they receive support from the international community through international aid. Now, international aid is very, very useful in terms of mobilizing resources towards particular countries. But in some cases, it could reduce the effectiveness or the legitimacy of the institutions. Some low-income countries, for example, in some low-income countries, local elites might decide that poverty reduction is to do with, it's a responsibility of the international community, and it's not a responsibility of themselves as domestic governments. So aid might actually get in the way of generating sufficient legitimacy for social assistance institutions. It might also have the effect of reducing effectiveness if the implementation of social assistance programs is not, for example, scrutinized by Parliament, is not evaluated, the public receives no information about this program. It's likely that their effectiveness will be less than optimal. Now, I'm not kind of singling out international aid here, but clearly funding social protection out of natural resources might also have similar implications in terms of legitimacy and effectiveness. It's really important to connect the resources coming from from the exploitation of natural sources to very clear processes of scrutiny on the part of Parliament and an agreement on the part of the general public. So we need to take these three things together: resource mobilization, legitimacy, and effectiveness. And it seems to me that the most significant source of financing is really taxation. we need to ensure that taxation contributes resources to financing social assistance that is perceived to be as legitimate within those countries, and that it aids the effectiveness of the implementation of social assistance. Can we move to the next one? Here you find for selected countries the level and the distribution of social spending, which is in the top chart, and also the distribution and level of tax revenues, which is on the bottom chart. I'm just going to focus on the bottom chart at the moment. The figures come from a set of very interesting studies which have been produced by the Commitment to Equity program, and you have the reference there. They are covering most countries, most low and middle income countries, and if you have a particular interest on a particular country, I'm sure you will find in the website information on the country of your interest. Now, the point that I wanted to make using the chart at the bottom is that, again, there is no one-to-one relationship between the level of economic development and the volume of resources in an economy which are come to the government in the form of revenues, mainly tax revenues. You see, for example, from the figure that the round bit is gross national income per capita, which is an indication of economic development. And you see that Brazil, on the right-hand side of your picture, collects around 35%, between 30 and 35% of GDP in the form of taxation, which is matching the level of economic development in Brazil. But you have countries to the right, for example, Chile and others, where the level of economic development is much higher than the proportion of GNR, which goes to the government in the form of taxation. So again, it depends very much on institutions and politics, and particularly on social contracts. I'd say something also about the composition of the tax revenues. You see there that there is this distinction made between direct taxes, which are taxes on income, mainly corporation taxes, indirect taxes like VAT and other taxes on consumption, and on social security contributions. And you see that for the majority of the countries in there, particularly middle income countries, most tax revenues come from either direct taxation, corporate taxation, but also from consumption taxes, and particularly VAT. One of the what is different about Brazil is that you have a very high collection of social security contributions, which is not really the case for the other countries. If I could move on to the next one. Right, so if you look at social assistance or anti-poverty transfers, and remember the point we made in the last slide that the capacity of government to collect taxes is not really in direct relationship with the level of economic development, but has a lot to do with the kind of institutional setup and kind of the kind of social contracts in the different countries. So it's important that we connect social assistance to forms of revenue. And the way that I think it would be best to do this is by looking at what I describe as financial narratives. Whenever governments, national governments, expand social assistance, they usually argue that the source of financing comes from very specific sources. So I have some examples for you. In Chile, for example, which returned to democracy after 17 years in 1990, the government decided to expand expenditure on reducing poverty and also on healthcare. And what they did was to connect this to an increase in VAT. So the government said we're going to raise the rate of VAT by 2 percentage points, and the funding is going to be allocated or assigned to poverty reduction and health insurance. In Bolivia, the connection is between the provision of pensions and the revenues from natural resources. It was a more involved, complicated process, but there is a connection between the two. In Lesotho and Swaziland, the introduction of anti-poverty program was linked to the revenues from the South African Custom Union. And in Zambia and other countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, there was a link made between governments and donors through a memorandum of understanding, and in some cases it was related to the debt cancellation program, as in the case of Ghana. So I think what is important in terms of looking at how different countries, particularly low-income countries, how can they expand their financing of social assistance, it's important to look at these financial narratives, to look at how governments can actually justify to their citizenship, to their citizens, how where the funding is going to come from. And if I could have the next slide. And it's in that context that I want to say something about social contracts, because there has been a very rapid expansion of anti-poverty transfer programs and social assistance in all low and middle income countries. In some regions, particularly Latin America and increasingly in East Asia, the increase in government resources to social assistance is quite significant. In Sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in lower income countries, there's also been an influx of international assistance to support social assistance expansion. But I want to say something about social contracts, because in the countries that have shown the largest increase in social assistance, they kind of at the bottom of that process are kind of the renewal of social contracts. In some cases, we can see social contracts in action. For example, Brazil expanded investment in social assistance after the return to democracy in 1985 and the development of a new constitution in 1998 that established new rights in the area of social and economic support. The same for South Africa. They returned, the fall of apartheid led to a new constitution in 1996 that spelled out a new social contract in which social assistance was included specifically. In the case of China, the expansion of social assistance and social insurance comes from a new policy of increasing social harmony and social inclusion. So in those countries, you can see that political processes have led to an agreement to realize economic and social rights. In other countries, there isn't a single event or a constitution that has supported these processes, but nonetheless, you can see that processes are underway. Now, we have different ways of describing or defining social contracts. It seems to me that a social contract describes a situation in which in different societies, people set aside their specific individual interests or group interests with the intention of establishing institutions that are fair to everyone. So that to me is perhaps the most precise definition of social contracts, in which the agreements that people have about their objectives and priorities of policy by governments have this kind of generalized support among the population. Fiscal contracts are important too, because taxation requires the assent of people. Taxation is an act of expropriation on the part of states and governments. Therefore, it requires some political support from the population. So fiscal contracts and social contracts are important in lending support to the expansion of social assistance. And if I could come to my last slide. Okay, so these are my conclusions. Most countries spend between 1 and 2% of GDP on social assistance, depending on the type of welfare institutions they have. The main kind of policy implication is that countries should increase gradually, incrementally expenditure on social assistance. So if countries are on 1%, they should try to move to 2%. Countries are on less than 1% should try to move to 1%. How social assistance is financed is important because it has implications for the legitimacy and the effectiveness of the relevant institutions. In most low and middle income countries, tax revenues are the main source of financing for anti-poverty transfers of social assistance. And finally, social contracts, fiscal contracts, financial narratives are important because they lend legitimacy to these emerging institutions. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Armando. That was a very good presentation. I specifically found the introducing the financial narratives quite an important aspect. We have quite a few questions that have popped up, so I'm going to turn off my video now and we'll go towards just a plain screen. As I said earlier in this webinar, we will go forward with directed questions first and then follow with more general questions. So for Michael first, we have a question about, isn't it true that these costs of social protection systems are also income for other parts of the economy? And would stronger social compacts mean that government is effectively helping the economy stabilize or adjust? And for Armando, I'll give you that afterwards, could you elaborate on the relationship between social rights and social protection, and how do we defend state involvement in finding more resources? So Michael, I'll hand that over to you first.
Yes, thank you, Dan. Indeed, I think this is a very important question to think about for a second. You know, we often consider social expenditures of sorts and social transfers protection as a cost. It's something, money being spent, and then poof, the money is gone. Yeah. Now, it's a cost, and we heard this in Armando's presentation, to some economic actors. Obviously, it's a disbursement of pension is a cost to a pension fund. Yeah. The payment of health benefits to an extent is a cost to, I don't know, a health ministry, an insurance company. But from a macroeconomic perspective, we have to understand everything that's a cost to some is an income to others. Yeah? Income is the flip side of expenditures. Yeah? Everything in a closed economy, everything that's spent in a closed economy will be income to somebody else. Imagine, we have a legislation that says cement factories will need to install carbon capture filters. Oh, that's a cost to the cement factory, obviously. Yeah, but it's an income to the producers of carbon capture filters. There is no negative net effect on the macroeconomy in a closed economy. Likewise, with social spending, everything that's a cost to some is an income to someone else. And through that, in a macroeconomy, you know, the money doesn't get lost. It gets recycled somewhere in expanding healthcare sectors, which create opportunities in businesses. So I think that's very important to keep in mind from a macro perspective. Now, of course, we don't live in a closed economy. All economies are open economies, and there are leakages. So some of that money that a retired person receives will be spent on the import of goods and services. That's a leakage, right? Okay, that happens in all economies. That happens with everything. But you know, this cannot be addressed by saying we don't give money to the older persons or to those in need. This has to be addressed by creating an attractive business environment at home, where also businesses at home develop that can produce competitive goods and services. So absolutely, you know, social spending through protection mechanisms, through other mechanisms, is actually not just a cost from a macro perspective at all. It's a cost to an individual economic actor, and we have to be clear of this difference, and it can help to stimulate the economy. Beyond that, to promote greater social cohesion and integration, and it's a topic that's very big in the Latin American region, is important for an economy, because we know much more than in the past, and there is so much evidence now that shows societies that are very unequal in terms of the distribution of income or wealth do less well and are less robust than societies that have a greater social cohesion. So absolutely I would agree with that comment for these reasons. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Armando, would you like to comment on your question?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. I think the three points that you raised, the capacity of the states to collect revenues, the expansion of social rights, and the development of and establishment of social protection institutions are really different sides of the same coin in that they usually come together. The expansion of social assistance in low and middle income countries reflects an increasing recognition on the part of governments that they are responsible for poverty reduction and even more than that, poverty eradication. They have a responsibility to take steps and design their policies with the objective of eradicating poverty. So all three really are kind of different kind of dimensions, different sides of the same coin. And I wanted to kind of show you this with a couple of examples. In high-income countries, the expectation that we have about social protection institutions, particularly social assistance, is that they will be financed by the better off, and then the government will take those resources and direct them to the people that are worse off. But in most developing countries, because the main source of financing comes from consumption taxes, we'll find that the situation is slightly different. That basically most people, however poor they are, they contribute in the form of consumption taxes. And perhaps this is another reason why you have an expansion of social assistance, is because of the fiscal citizenship that is involved through consumption taxes. In Brazil, it has been estimated that the bottom decile of the population pays something like 20% of their income in consumption taxes. Another example is to do with natural resources. In many low and middle income countries, natural resources have generated a lot of capacity, financial capacity on the part of governments. Clearly, there is the expectations that natural resources are owned in common for all the citizens in the country. And therefore, there is an expectation that the benefits from natural resource exploitation should be directed to everyone and with a priority to the worst off. So I think that is how you can see in practice how the connection between social rights, the expansion of social protection, and state intervention to capture resources, how they come together.
Thank you very much, Armando. I'm hopefully you're still there. I'm not sure if that was the end of your presentation or your answer. We have another. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, Armando. I thought you dropped out there for a second. Continue.
I forgot to say that was the end of my answer, but it was.
Okay, very good. We actually have one more for you. We have one more for Armando, and then we have some more general questions, which, while not directed, go towards both of you, obviously. For Armando, isn't it true to say that tax finance programs is usually tied with strong social contract when it is? And in fact, is it better to understand a form of social insurance? In other words, the social contract is stronger when tax finance schemes are seen as entitlement that all people can benefit but all contribute to, rather than a form of Robin Hood contract. Sorry, that's for you, Armando.
Okay. Right. It's a complicated question, so let me try to kind of take it in parts. The difference between social insurance and social assistance is that social insurance entitlements are based on contributions. They are contributory based. People who contribute to a social insurance fund have then the capacity to draw entitlements. If they retire, for example, or if they are unemployed, they can have access to unemployment insurance. Social assistance, on the other hand, is citizenship based. The access to entitlement depends partly on their being citizens of the country or residents in some countries too, and on particular levels of socioeconomic conditions on the part of the individuals or communities or households concerned. So in a sense, I think the question misses out this difference between the two. It is actually social assistance that is citizenship based, and social insurance that is contributory based. Now, you have, of course, a wide range of institutions in different countries. And if you take Germany, for example, the majority of the population, the vast majority of the population, are included within the social insurance, national social insurance scheme, and therefore social assistance is not that significant. But in Latin American countries, where the access to social insurance institutions is restricted to formal sector workers, the majority of the population in the region are outside them, and their main sources of support come from social assistance. It has been estimated that Latin America, something like 51 to 53% of workers are in informal employment, and they only have access to social assistance, not social insurance. So in most low and middle income countries, social insurance tends to be very limited as a form of social protection. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. It was a rather deep question, as it were. Now we've got some undirected, but rather I think maybe focused questions I'm going to put forward. One is, well, it's to the both of you if you'd like to chime in. And Michael, I guess you can go first, and Armando, you can follow up since you've just gone. Question, wouldn't you say that international aid funding can generate government buy-in, therefore building legitimacy? And following on that from another question, is there a relation between legitimacy and effectiveness? And finally, a third question, what actions can help shift existing social contracts that reflect limited care for the poor towards more altruistic social contracts in countries with very low levels? And I'll let Michael start out with that one.
Thank you, Dan, for these questions. In fact, you said other questions were difficult. I think this is a super difficult one. And I just, can you please repeat I think it was a 3-part question, really. Can you please repeat the last part of the question to make sure that
So these are actually 3 questions from 3 different participants. The first, I'll just go back over them. Wouldn't you say that aid funding can generate government buy-in, therefore building legitimacy, funds coming from international aid? The second was, is there a relation between legitimacy and effectiveness? And the last one to repeat is, what actions can help shift the existing social contracts that reflect limited care for the poor towards a more altruistic social contract in countries with very low income levels?
Yeah, thank you very much. In fact, okay, 3 questions. Indeed, I think all of them are very well taken. They are not easy to answer. Maybe they would require a research project or a deeper conversation. Let me start with the first one. Can aid create government buy-in and also legitimacy? You know, I do think very much that countries need to be in the driver's seat of their policies and their programs. I think it's very difficult to generate buy-in from the outside. I think, you know, the action has to be taken at the country level. It has to be truly owned by the country. If a country really owns it and I think Armando also said that earlier, there is also a case, of course, for aid, especially in the poorest countries, to complement government and domestic efforts that's necessary in the poorest countries. And I don't think aid can drive the expansion of social protection systems if they are not owned. In fact, I think that might not work. And I think it will not create a legitimacy, and it will probably not create a very effective system. The second question, does greater legitimacy help to create greater efficacy? Certainly, I think if we are living in a society where we have a common understanding of a social contract, where we have a common understanding that it's important not to leave people behind, to support the weakest. I think we have fewer incentives to evade taxes, to avoid contributing to this system. So in that sense, I think a strong social consensus and legitimacy of a system that's really considered to be important can help to make that system work better, because it tries to prevent people or companies or economic actors from not contributing to that system. So I think maybe that's the case. The question is, do we have that? I think we have strong systems of that sort, probably in relatively small and relatively homogeneous countries. The bigger your country, maybe the more difficult it is to have this common and coherent understanding. If I think of Denmark, if I think of Sweden, even Austria, Switzerland, some of these really small economies, I think we have a pretty good social contract and a common understanding. The bigger the country, maybe the weaker this common understanding. And what actions, to the last question, what actions can help to shape stronger social contracts? I think it has to be a social dialogue. There is no, and I'm wondering whether we are actually having a social dialogue in many countries. I think the social dialogue has to be the basis for the social contract. And in many cases, I think there's decisions to reform pension systems without a broad and informed dialogue. It's a dialogue between pension fund administrators, actuaries, economists, a few government people. I'm not sure we have these broad dialogues, for example, about reforms of pension systems that would be necessary. Now in Germany, in my home country, we've undertaken quite a few quite far-reaching reforms of retirement age and other things, and they just went through without much of a discussion, at least much of a public discussion. In France, on the other hand, decisions to change the retirement system, to change the pension system, have led to big protests on the streets. I think in neither case we had much of a real public dialogue. It's a dialogue that's dominated by actuarians or basically accountants. They tell you, well, we have these receipts into pension funds, we have these expenditures on pension funds, therefore our pension funds are broken, therefore we have to reform our pension funds. But there's no discussion on what's the scope to raise more resources, what's the scope to limit resources, how should we reallocate resources, maybe we want a different pension system altogether. None of this, I think, is taking place. So it's very much of an accounting perspective. We have to open this up to a broader discussion. Having said that, I think I see a lot of action that actually will further undermine the social protection systems that we have today. And I see that, for example, in the insurance industry. Insurance obviously is a very important part of social protection because it pools risk. We cannot ensure risks that are very likely from happening, right? So we can't really provide benefits or social protection benefits through insurance mechanisms that only include poor people to poor people, because there's a very high risk of poor people defaulting. So the way an insurance works, it pools risk from a lot of different population groups, the rich, the poor, many different groups, and then extends insurance to the poorest. What I see in many cases is a fragmentation of the insurance industry. Yeah? Better rates are given to people that have better and healthier lifestyles, that go to the gym, that live better, that live, yeah. But we are fragmenting a system. We are basically decreasing the costs for those that live better. That's an incentive, and I think we all would probably say, well, this makes sense. Yeah? But what you're doing, what is the counterpart of this is, you're creating a system with very high costs for people that live unhealthy or have a higher risk of falling ill or being poor. Yeah? So you're fragmenting the system, and while it's understandable that you want to give, have fewer charges for those that live good lives, the counterpart is you have higher charges for those that can't, that don't. And basically it becomes unaffordable insurance to many, or a social protection system. So there is risks to a fragmentation of the system, especially also in the insurance industry that I'm seeing right now today. Dan, back to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Armando, if you'd like to comment on those questions as well. And then after that, I'll just say we have 2 more questions coming up, and then possibly 1 note.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I'll be brief because, as you say, more questions are coming. On the issue of aid and domestic buying, I welcome the question because it allows me to be a bit more nuanced in terms of the role of international assistance in the expansion of financing for social assistance programs. I think there is a very important role for international finance. We know, for example, that introducing social assistance programs is actually very costly in the first place. You need to develop information systems, you need to develop capacity for the relevant agencies, you need to develop financial systems for transferring cash if the programs are cash-based to different participants. You need a great deal of infrastructure that in most low-income countries in particular is just not in place. And I think international assistance has a really important role to play in facilitating that process, particularly the very high setup costs of these programs. I think also international assistance has an important role in supporting research into the effectiveness of different programs. We know that, for example, impact evaluations are very costly because they require household survey data, which is expensive to collect, and it requires also very specific range of skills. And that's also another area where international assistance can play a very significant role in promoting the expansion of social assistance. However, I don't think that it would be an appropriate role for international aid to actually finance the transfers to individual participants, and it could generate issues of legitimacy and effectiveness. And I think, particularly in low-income countries, this is a difficult kind of trade-off to make. But I think we need to be very conscious of the difficulties that may arise in the future. There is the issue, the question on legitimacy and effectiveness. There isn't a one-to-one relationship between the two. There are programs that are very legitimate in the sense that they have wide support from the population, but they might not be very effective. And again, you might have very effective programs that might not be able to get sufficient legitimacy from the population. An interesting example was Nicaragua, for example. It had a CCT program that was very effective, but the incoming government decided to do something else instead and closed it down. So I think we need to look at, we need to evaluate legitimacy and effectiveness kind of separate. The ideal is to count social assistance that is both legitimate and effective. On the second part of the question, how can we strengthen social contracts? It's a kind of difficult question to answer because I don't think it's a matter of particular policy intervention, policy instrument that would deliver this is more to do with the configuration of politics and social preferences in particular countries. So that usually countries that are more democratic or have processes of democratization, I gave you examples of South Africa and Brazil, tend to generate support for increasing expenditure on anti-poverty programs. It is also the case that having effective institutions is important in generating political support. Where you have programs that are effective, then it is harder for new governments, for example, to kind of change them. So where there is effectiveness, perceived effectiveness of particular programs, that tends to strengthen the support among the population and voters for social systems. So I think those two points are important, that we ensure that programs are effective and that processes of democratization tend to contribute to improve social contracts. I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Armando. Those were very good answers to those questions. We just have about 10 minutes left, so I'm just going to narrow this down to 2 general questions. So if you could just each use about 5 minutes to answer those, I realize that's very difficult. So the first question is, the discussion here of overseas development assistance as a source of funding for social protection in the poorest countries is pretty negative, and yet it is promoted by social protection floor advocates. What are your opinions of this? And the second question is, it concerns corruption, in that oftentimes corruption still happens backstage, and the money does not reach the populations it is intended to. Corruption is a main issue. It happens all around the world when it relates with policy systems. So what is the remedy for this? And how do we ensure that the money from the benefits will benefit all of society? Michael, if you want to lead with that one.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I would love to ask the person who posed the question back, do you think we should get serious about eradicating extreme poverty? Should we get serious about reducing inequalities? And of course, to some extent, I think it's maybe a rhetorical question, because we just had a big agreement here of the international community on the Sustainable Development Goals, and one of them is to eradicate, not further reduce, but actually eradicate altogether extreme poverty. And the other one is to reduce inequalities. Now, this is a global consensus. I think it's also a consensus in many countries that this is something they want to achieve. If that is the objective, and I'm thinking now of some of the poorest countries in the world, the least developed countries, there are only 2 ways to go about reaching this objective. One, and this is most importantly, these countries have to create productive and remunerative employment opportunities for the people. That's the way to sustainably really reduce extreme poverty. But secondly, countries will need to have, and there is no question about it, even the poorest, a system of social protection, a basic social protection floor. And there is, in fact, all countries of the world agree to the corresponding resolutions of the International Labour Organization to institute a basic social protection floor. It is a national objective, and I think it's an objective that is even possible in an environment with very, very limited resources. Of course, these won't be elaborate systems of social protection, but nonetheless, they will be systems of social protection. It will be a start to develop a system that can be expanded also as economies are growing. So I think it's very important to have, even in a context of weak economic development. Of course, an important way to strengthen the system is also in very poor countries through the formalization of economic activities. A lot of economic activities are not formalized. They have a large informal sector, and that means tax revenues are low, taxation is low, contribution payments are relatively low, and the black economy has to be reduced, or the informal economy. That's essential. Now, corruption, yes, of course, corruption happens, and it happens everywhere. I'm a great advocate for curbing corruption and taking measures to curb corruption. I don't think that the existence of corruption should be an argument for not implementing or not pursuing policies that are right. Yeah? I would rather like to see these two as separate, and I would say countries have to do everything possible they can to minimize corruption. Yeah? But at the same time, I think they should do everything they can to create meaningful social protection systems. I outlined earlier what I meant by that. Systems that don't just provide a safety net, but actually ideally also empower people. Systems that are not that, fragmented, but maybe an integrated system that looks at protection throughout a life course. And ODA, should it support something like that? As I mentioned in my intervention just before, if a country is serious about creating such a system, I do think ODA can support something like that. But of course, finances, dollars are fungible. Yeah. So if a country allocates ODA to another country, that money can be used for all kinds of purposes. We never know what the last tax dollar or the last ODA dollar is going to be spent on. So yes, I think ODA can support such systems. Should ODA support the recurrent costs of these systems, and to what extent is a discussion that I think we have to have, and that's context specific. But ODA can help to provide a safety net. And in fact, a lot of ODA already goes to the social sectors, to health, to education, to many other aspects of social policies that would be part of an integrated social protection system. I think there is space for ODA to support that, and maybe the case for ODA to these sectors is even stronger than ODA to the private sector. That should theoretically be a commercially viable undertaking. Yeah. Although, that's I don't want to say ODA is not important for economic infrastructure and production sectors. Obviously, it is. It's important for economic infrastructure, but maybe and for all public goods. But certainly, social protection is a public good, and ODA could go to that sector. I leave my answer at that. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for staying to time. It's quite appreciated. Armando, you have about 5 minutes to also respond. I'll leave that to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, on the issue of the role of assistance in social protection, I don't want to repeat my previous answer, but take an example. Say a country like Uganda. Uganda collects 13% of GDP in taxes, 13% of GDP. If you're interested in supporting Uganda, develop its social protection institutions, and particularly develop its effectiveness in poverty reduction. Extreme poverty is around 25% in Uganda. I think the priority is to look at their tax system rather than to look at aid. It might be helpful in the short run, but sustainable social protection institutions would only come about in Uganda if you do have strong and fair tax systems that provide the government with the resources they need to ensure minimum standards of living for all. So that is my answer to the first part of the question. The second issue is about corruption. I think that it's important that social assistance programs are perceived to be effective and free of corruption. One important characteristic of new social protection programs in middle-income countries and low-income countries is that they are rules-based. There are sets of rules that determine when and how people can draw their entitlements. In middle-income countries, there are processes of appeal. There is supervision of the relevant agencies by government. There is also increasingly accountability to communities. For example, Brazil has social assistance councils where civil society and local stakeholders can have a say in how social assistance policies are implemented at the municipal and the state and the federal level. So all those features of rules-based programs are really important in restricting corruption and the kind of undermining that corruption produces in programs. I think in the last kind of 2 minutes that I have left, I want to say something about politics, because the connection between social assistance politics is very strong, and it should be. In a sense, all social protection institutions that are public reflect solidarity values in society, and therefore they are inherently political. There are very clear, observable electoral consequences of countries introducing anti-poverty programs, because effectively you are incorporating into political discussion, political debate, sectors that had been excluded previously. So that there are kind of clear electoral implications of these programs. But I think that is very separate from corruption. I think it's to be welcomed that sectors that have been excluded are now more actively participant in political processes. So I think I wouldn't at all put that into the kind of corruption box. It's actually very welcome and very important. And in fact, a lot of social assistance, even by the very fact that people have to be registered to access social assistance entitlements, and in some cases they have to be registered in the electoral register to access entitlements, is actually generating much greater political participation from these groups. And I finished my answer there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Armando, and thank you for bringing up the, that could be an entire course in itself, the electoral side of issues. But I do appreciate you bringing that up. We're just going to close out there, and I'd like to thank both Michael and Armando for participating. I'd like to thank all of our attendees for signing on and participating as well. I just want to bring up, if you could fill in a small survey that will come around via email, that would make it much easier for us to improve and to know what we can do to make these webinars more effective for you. The next webinar will be somewhere towards the later part of the year, and we'll focus more on pensions. Again, thank you all, and have a wonderful day.